Well, good evening. If I see people are still joining, so we'll let that go on for a moment. I'm Kate DeWitt with the Kensington Historical Society. Welcome. See, we've got a really nice group here on Zoom. Hopefully, we captured all the people who were going to be intrepid and come 2 weeks ago. It's certainly can't envision that we would have had a very good time trying to get to town hall and enjoy this presentation in the middle of trying to deal with snowcrete. So welcome. And as you know, Kensington Historical Society enjoys having speakers, particularly from around the county, to talk about interesting things they've been discovering. And this year in particular, because Montgomery County, as well as the US, is celebrating its 250th anniversary, we're focusing on Montgomery County history. So this is our kind of kickoff to that. And I was thinking, I'm going to introduce our speakers, but I was thinking as I was looking over the story of how they came to make this presentation, it's really enjoyable to see what curious people do when they get interested in a subject area. They start pulling the thread and find out all kinds of cool things. So Juanita and Dianne have done that. And our speakers today are Juanita Williams and Dianne Bradley. They're out in Leisure World and started out in a book club, a African-American book club at Leisure World, and came across the story of Paul Edmonson and got interested and decided to learn more and know more, and as a result share with us. But they then created the Paul Edmonson Historical Society, and was actually, I guess, the Leisure World Edmonson Historical Society, of which they are co-presidents. And it'll be fun to learn about the legacy and the history of the Edmonson family in particular. And it's also fun to, we're so used to driving past Leisure World, now we'll have a chance to envision what was there before, and it'll enhance our appreciation of our county history. So take it away. We're going to ask you to put your questions in chat. So after their presentations, I'll collect those and we'll have a nice discussion. So thank you, and everyone enjoy.
Good evening, everyone. Before it was Leisure World, it was the Edmondson Farm. Many of you are probably familiar with the senior adult living community Leisure World in the Norbeck area of Montgomery County. You might have passed the Big Globe on Georgia Avenue just south of Olney, which sits at the main entrance to Leisure World. As residents of this community, the African Heritage Book Club was excited to discover, while reading the book, Escape on the Pearl, that land once owned by a former enslaved man, Paul Edmonson, sat on what is now a part of Leisure World. This led us to wanting to know more about this family and other families descended from slavery who lived in the Norbeck area. So in 2016, the Leisure World Edmonson Historical Society was formed, of which I am a founding member, and I am Juanita Seeley Williams.
And I'm Dianne Bradley, and we both live in Leisure World, and we're the co-presidents of the Leisure World Edmonson Historical Society. Today, we're going to take you on a journey that explores the history and contributions that Paul Edmonson and his family made to the abolitionist and ultimately the civil rights movements in Montgomery County and beyond. I'm having trouble forwarding my slides.
You click in your PowerPoint window.
I'm sorry.
Just click anywhere and then try and advance.
Okay. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's picture Maryland, specifically the Norbeck area, in the year 1765. Slavery was still legal. Maryland was considered a southern state, and tobacco farming was a mainstay in Maryland. Paul Edmondson was born in Montgomery County, Maryland, enslaved to a woman named Margaret Lansonby, a white widowed slaveholder. Paul worked for her until he was 25 years old. We're not sure what he did, probably farming. At that time, enslaved people were sometimes able to do a little work on their own, such as farming or craftsmanship. They would do a little side hustle. And they were able to keep their earnings if this was something they did after they had finished their own chores. And Paul did this, and he saved up enough money to buy his freedom from Margaret Lansonby in 1810. 2 years later, Paul fell in love with an enslaved woman named Amelia, who was 20 years old and who was owned by William and Rebecca Culver, and they were married. The Culvers granted Amelia special dispensation to live with Paul if she and their children worked for them. Paul and Amelia had 14 children. So this lady got a really good deal. She had all of these, not only Amelia, but all of these 14 children working. And then, of course, she collected whatever they worked, whatever they earned. The adoption of a 1661 Virginia law by the southern states, including Maryland, and remember, this was way back in the 1600s, required that all of Paul and Amelia's children were bound to Amelia's slaveholders. And this is what the law said. It was actually passed in England when the states were colonies. It mandated that the children of enslaved mothers would inherit the legal status of their mothers. This system of racial slavery based on heritability required a clear understanding that enslaved women gave birth to enslaved children. The Culvers farmed out the Edmonson children from as early as 13 or 14 years old for paid services, and they worked mostly for elite Washingtonian families as servants, laborers, and skilled workers. But of course, all of their wages went to their slaveholders. Paul's legacy as a free man could not be passed on to his wife or his children, and instead it was Amelia's unfortunate birthright that had to be passed down. In 1835, Paul purchased his first 20 acres of farmland in the Norbeck area, which is now part of Leisure World, for $250 and moved his family there. And this part that we have outlined here is the part that we believe that was his farmland. And this is where our connection with the Edmondson family originates. And in 1847, he more than doubled the size of his farm with the purchase of an additional contiguous 25 acres for $280. With these purchases, totaling 45 acres of land, he had one of the largest Black-owned farms in Montgomery County at that time. And then this is what his farm, part of his farm, looks like today. Despite their limitations, remember, all of the families were enslaved, working for other people except for Paul. The Edmondson farm was profitable. Along with 3 laborers that Paul employed and boarded to help run the farm, but of course no enslaved people working on his farm, the family raised fruits and vegetables as well as oats, corn, and potatoes. With a horse and cart, Paul drove his crops into the city by way of Brookville Road, which is today's Georgia Avenue, and sold them in the lucrative markets in Washington, D.C. I'm going to go back to this map for a minute. This land in Leisure World is very close. You can see Norbeck Road there if you have a big enough screen, and where it meets Georgia Avenue. And this is around where his farm was at this intersection. So you can imagine him going down Georgia Avenue with his fruits and vegetables, which was, of course, a dirt road then, and a horse and cart, all the way to DC, because that's where the really lucrative markets were. The family was resilient, and their farm endured for 22 years before they sold it for a mere $800 in 1857. Now, their farm was not worth as much as some in the area because there were no enslaved people attached to the sale. During these times, enslaved individuals were more valuable than the economic potential of farmland and was tied to the number and productivity of these enslaved individuals. So when people sold their farms, they would often sell the enslaved people that worked there with the farm, which made them much more valuable. Paul Edmondson's goal was to secure the freedom of all of his family members. There were a limited number of ways to accomplish this. For some, he purchased their freedom, using the profits from his farm. He also worked with organizations to raise money for their emancipation. He helped some escape to northern states, and he even required the suitors of his daughters to purchase their freedom before marrying them. Paul proved very adept at creating and negotiating ways to free his family from slavery. In 1848, 7 of his children tried to escape on their own, and Juanita's going to tell you more about this daring attempted escape.
On the evening of April 15th, 1848, a portion of the children of Paul and Amelia Edmondson, Samuel, Ephraim, Richard, John, 15-year-old Mary, and 13-year-old Emily embarked on a daring attempt to escape to freedom. They were part of a group of over 70 individuals who worked in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, seeking liberty on a 54-ton schooner called the Pearl. Abolitionists, possibly including the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, had organized the escape, leaving from Washington, D.C. The Pearl was meant to carry them on a perilous journey. They planned to sail the schooner down the Potomac River and then up the Chesapeake Bay through the Delaware River to reach New Jersey, where they hoped to find sanctuary. However, their hopes were dashed when a storm developed, forcing them to drop anchor at a cornfield harbor near Point Lookout Peninsula. 35 armed men, led by Joseph Bruin, had chased after the schooner using a steamship named Salem. They overtook the Pearl, and everyone on board, including the Edmondson children, were captured and returned to D.C. In the aftermath of the recapture of the Pearl's fugitives, the fate of those who were caught posed a dire threat. They were likely to be sold south, a term referring to the practice of sending enslaved individuals to the deep South states, where the conditions were harsher and escape opportunities were minimal. In response to this impending tragedy, family and friends of the recaptured individuals, including the Edmondson family, made valiant efforts to save their loved ones by purchasing their freedom. Joseph Bruin, who operated a significant slave warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia, saw an opportunity to profit from the situation. This is a sample of what his slave pen looked like. He offered $4,500 for the 6 Edmondsons who had been transferred to his slave pen, located at 1701 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia. The lady for whom Mary had worked offered $1,000 for Mary to save her from being sold south. Bruin callously refused the offer, insisting that he could get much more for her in the New Orleans slave market. But an outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans prevented him from selling them there. He eventually agreed to the price of $2,250. If he had sold them in New Orleans, they would have been used as prostitutes. Finally, on November 4th, 1848, the efforts of Paul Edmondson and the Northern abolitionists raised the money to free Mary and Emily. The girls were now ready to begin a new chapter in their lives. Dianne will now share the Edmondson sisters' next experience.
Between 1846 and 1853, all the Edmondsons were freed, including Amelia. And I did just read there was one son, who they are not sure. He was sold down in to New Orleans to the south, and they're not sure what happened to him. But all the rest of the Edmondsons were freed. Some were purchased by Paul, and the freedom of his daughters who married were purchased by their husbands. Paul also sought out abolitionist supporters who helped raise money to purchase enslaved people, to give them their freedom, and also to help them escape to northern states. While meeting with Washington area supporters, Paul corresponded with and eventually met Reverend Henry Ward Beecher and his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, who were known abolitionists. Beecher's church members raised the funds to purchase two of the Edmondson sisters, Mary and Emily, and helped pay for their emancipation. Accompanied by William L. Chaplin, a white abolitionist who helped pay for the Pearl escape attempt, Beecher went to Washington to arrange the transaction. Mary and Emily Edmondson were purchased for $2,250 and were emancipated on November 4th, 1848. In total, Paul paid or raised more than $4,250 to free Amelia and their children. Now contrast that with the fact that Paul sold his 45 acres of productive farmland for only $800. And it was worth so little because, of course, it had no enslaved people attached to it. Mary and Emily's journey to freedom, marked by the perseverance and unwavering support of abolitionists, showcased the power of collective action between Blacks and whites at this time, and highlighted the importance of the abolitionist movement in challenging the institution of slavery. After gaining their freedom, daughters Mary and Emily were notable activists, becoming an integral part of the first civil rights movement. The sisters participated in anti-slave rallies around New York State with Ward Beecher. And as part of participating in these rallies, they became passionate advocates against the Fugitive Slave Acts. And Juanita's going to tell you a little bit more about these acts.
The Fugitive Slave Acts. The Fugitive Slave Acts were a pair of federal laws that allowed for the capture and return of runaway enslaved people within the territory of the United States. Despite the inclusion of the Fugitive Slave Clause in the United States Constitution, anti-slavery sentiment remained high in the North throughout the late 1780s and early 1790s, and many petitioned Congress to abolish the practice outright. Bowing to the pressure from the Southern lawmakers, the first Fugitive Slave Act was enacted by Congress in 1793. It authorized local governments, owners, and their agents to seize and return escapees to their owners and imposed $500 penalties on anyone who aided in their flight. Statutes regarding refugee slaves existed in America as early as 1643. The New England Confederation and slave laws were later enacted in several of the 13 original colonies. Among others, New York passed a 1705 measure designed to prevent runaways from fleeing to Canada. Virginia and Maryland drafted laws offering bounties for the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. By the time, yes, and this particular slide you see that was posted by Thomas Jefferson, our former president, a runaway from the subscriber in Albemarle, a mulatto slave called Sandy, about 35 years of age, and his stature is rather low, inclining to corpulence, and his complexion light. He's a shoemaker by trade, in which he uses his left hand principally and can do carpenter's work. He's something of a horse jockey. He's greatly addicted to drink, and when drunk, is insolent and disorderly. So this is an ad that was put up by Thomas Jefferson to capture someone who had escaped from him. There are many statutes regarding slaves which existed in America as early as 1643. The New England Confederation and slave laws were later enacted in several of the 13 original colonies. Among others, New York passed a 1705 measure designed to prevent runaways from fleeing to Canada. Virginia and Maryland drafted laws offering bounties for the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. By the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, many northern states, including Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, had abolished slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was immediately met with a firestorm of criticism. Northerners bristled at the idea of turning their states into a stalking ground for bounty hunters, and many argued that the law was tantamount to legalized kidnapping. Some abolitionists organized clandestine resistance groups and built complex networks of safe houses to aid enslaved people in their escape to the North. We know them as the Underground Railroad. Refusing to be complicit in the institution of slavery, most Northern states intentionally neglected to enforce the law. Several even passed so-called personal liberty laws that gave accused runaways the right to a jury trial and also protected free blacks, many of whom had been abducted by bounty hunters and sold into slavery. One famous case concerns Solomon Northup, a freeborn black musician who was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841. Northup spent 12 years enslaved in Louisiana before winning back his freedom in 1853. Maybe you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave. Following increased pressure from Southern politicians, Congress passed a revised Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Part of Henry Clay's famed Compromise of 1850, a group of bills that helped to quiet early calls for Southern secession. This new law forcibly compelled citizens to assist in the capture of runaways. It also denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial and increased the penalty for interfering with the rendition process to $1,000 and 6 months in jail. It also placed control of individual cases in the hands of federal commissioners. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was met with even more impassioned criticism and resistance than the earlier measure. States like Vermont and Wisconsin passed new measures intended to bypass and even nullify the law, and measures intended to bypass and even nullify the law, and abolitionists redoubled their efforts to assist runaways. Here you see Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist, and he's speaking against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 at an anti-slavery meeting in Boston. And you can tell by his vigorous hand-raising hand that he's exhorting people to listen. And you see that many people are there, and even some freed blacks are in the audience. The Underground Railroad reached its peak in the 1850s, with many enslaved people fleeing to Canada. The law became unenforceable in certain northern states, but persisted until after the start of the Civil War. On June 28, 1864, Congress repealed both of the Fugitive Slave Acts. Mary and Emily worked with some abolitionists and attended the anti-slavery convention in Cazenovia, New York, right here. You see they are with Frederick Douglass at the convention, and that's him there in the black suit and white shirt. They are wearing plaid shawls that are on different sides of him. They continue their anti-slavery work, and Dianne will let you know about the next chapter in their lives.
While working directly with Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists speaking out against the 1850 fugitive slave law and slavery in general, the Edmonson sisters participated in mock slave auctions. These were designed by Beecher to attract publicity to the abolitionist cause. Mary and Emily were attractive, light-skinned women who spoke to audiences, telling them about their experiences about being enslaved. The story of their slavery, their escape attempt, and suffering was often repeated and reenacted to attract white attention. Beecher would then exhort his audience to imagine the fate that awaited a young woman such as these, what he called marketable commodities, in the fancy girl auctions of New Orleans. And of course, we know what that means. And you can see this is a depiction of one of the mock slave auctions that Henry Ward Beecher did. And he would appeal to audiences and show them what happened to young women like this. And you can see that it did attract a wide audience. You can see by how this venue is filled with people that a lot of people were supportive of the abolitionists at this time. During this time, also, the girls worked to support themselves and they worked as cleaning servants. But it was the same job actually that they had when they were enslaved. But for these jobs, the money that they earned belonged to them. Beecher's church continued to contribute money to send the sisters to school, which gave Mary and Emily the opportunity to pursue higher education. They first enrolled at New York Central College, which was an interracial institution in Cortland County, New York, founded by abolitionists. It was the first college in the U.S. that admitted all qualified students, regardless of race. They promoted the abolition of slavery and also the equality of the sexes. So you can see it was a college that was ahead of its time. It was operational only from 1849 to 1860, but consider that this is still before the Civil War. In 1853, the girls enrolled at Oberlin College in Ohio through the support of Beecher and his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Since shortly after its founding in the 1830s, the school had admitted Blacks as well as whites and was a center of abolitionist activity. Beecher Stowe had already written Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, we know that this was a fictional account of slavery, but it was based on interviews with enslaved people and former slaves. Some people, though, that read it didn't believe that slavery was as horrible as it was depicted in her book. So that same year, Stowe wrote a book called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which included some of the interviews that she had done and some of the stories, real stories that she had written. And it also included part of the Edmonson sisters' history, along with other factual accounts of slavery experiences. And you could tell from the title of this book how passionate she was about wanting to get across that these are real stories. It's a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, facts and documents upon which the story is founded, collaborative statements, the truth of the work. So she really wanted to make sure that people knew that what she had written in Uncle Tom's Cabin may have been a book of fiction, but that what was happening in there was true. I visited Oberlin College recently, and I was able to go to the Historical Society in Oberlin. And I was able to obtain some letters. This is a sample of one that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote to Mary and Emily, and also to the woman who was overseeing the college and overseeing the girls. And what I took away from that was what a significant interest Harriet Beecher Stowe had in these two girls. She was very protective of them, and she really followed their education while they were there. And they wrote letters back and forth. And you can see this one was to Mary. She says, "My dear Mary," and it's signed affectionately yours, H.B. Stowe. And I particularly was taken by, at the bottom there, she obviously had received a letter from Mary, and it had some misspellings in it. And she wrote back to her how to spell these words correctly. And so she really had a very significant interest and support of these two girls. Regrettably, just 6 months after their enrollment, Mary fell ill and succumbed to what was called pulmonary consumption, which we now know as tuberculosis. She passed away on May 18th, 1853, at the young age of 20. 18-year-old Emily returned to Washington, where her father lived, where she enrolled in the Normal School for Colored Girls. And this is the exact property where now the University of the District of Columbia sits. It's located near the current DuPont Circle. And this school trained young African American women to become teachers. And Emily taught African American children, and she continued her abolitionist work. She eventually settled with her husband and family, first in Sandy Spring, right here in Montgomery County, and then eventually in Washington, D.C. And Juanita is going to share a continued connection that we have with the Edmondson family and how their legacy lives on in Montgomery County and other places.
Paul Edmondson was a visionary who, once freed, was determined to leave a lasting legacy of a freed family, despite the fact that his children were originally bound to the economic hardships of slavery and forced to work for the benefit of their slaveholders. In 1857, Paul sold his farm to Kinsey Dyer for $800 and relocated to the Anacostia area of Washington, D.C., where some of his married daughters were living. The story of the Edmondson family did not end with Paul's death in 1863. The family's faith, perseverance, and resilience endured and resulted in the forging of notable Black families in Washington, D.C. They were instrumental in the formation of two dynamic Black churches, the Asbury United Methodist Church and John Wesley AME Zion Church. These churches in Washington, D.C. were active pillars in the civil rights movement. One of his descendants currently lives in Leisure World, Helen Mays Patrick. And another descendant, Maria Pinkleton of Georgia, has visited us here as a guest speaker and for the naming ceremony of Mutual Aid Team, the Edmondson Farm, where Dianne lives.
And where we are sitting at this very moment.
Right. And that's Helen on the right and Maria on the left. Several places in Leisure World bear the Edmondson name. You've already heard about the Edmondson Farm where we were just standing. And then there's also the Edmondson Park, which is near Georgia Avenue. And it has a marker, a historical marker that Helen's husband, Jack, created and had made for us. And then there's the Edmondson Room, which is located in Clubhouse 2 in Leisure World. We are proud to have part of our community sitting on the land that Paul Edmondson once owned and lived on. Is that you?
Yeah.
Sorry.
We also wanted to tell you about several books which have been written about the attempted escape on the Pearl. So these also live on with the Edmondson legacy. I think the most well-known one is probably Escape on the Pearl by Mary K. Ricks. And Mary K. Ricks is actually a local person. I believe she lives in Northern Virginia. There's also a book that was written about just Emily Edmondson and her flight from slavery and her attempted escape on the Pearl. And then there's another book that's written just about the escape on the Pearl. So you can see that their history lives on. There's also a statue of the Edmondson sisters, and it stands on the site of Joseph Bruin's former slave jail, the one that we showed you the picture of, where enslaved individuals were held and where the Edmondsons were held after their failed escape attempt on the Pearl in 1848. As Alexandria was historically a hub for domestic slave trade, this placement provides a direct physical and symbolic connection to the sisters' lived experience of enslavement and the slave trade in Alexandria. The statue depicts the sisters holding hands and stepping forward, symbolizing their resilience and their liberation from slavery. An etching of the ship, the Pearl, is on the back of the statue. I don't know if you can see that, but the second picture is an etching of the ship, the Pearl. And that connects visitors to the story of the Edmondson sisters' escapes and struggles. So you can see that the enduring history of the Edmondson family lives on in our area as well as other places even today. We're proud to have part of the community in which we live sitting on the land that Paul Edmondson once owned and lived on with his family. And we've renamed that part of Leisure World Edmondson Farm. The legacy of Paul Edmondson's struggle for the freedom of his family and the fight against the oppressive systems of slavery eventually became part of the broader movement to abolish slavery and played a part in securing civil rights for all people. And that is the end of our presentation, but we would certainly like to participate in a discussion. I think you're on mute.
You're unmuted, Mary. Oh, that's Kate.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. And what an amazing legacy that family had. 14 children, and the work they did to free them and continue on with their lives is just astonishing.
And their abolitionist work as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to go to the chat and see what we have here. When did Leisure World form? Now, that's been around quite some years, right?
Oh,
I
dear.
believe we're getting into our 60th
anniversary. Yeah.
Wow. You know, what was George Avenue like before that big globe, right?
Yeah.
Dirt road.
A little two-lane highway.
Right. I was particularly, I love this kind of segues from your introduction, how you came upon this story and researched this story. You've got some amazing information. And where did you find the majority of your material? You have some very specific historical information.
Well, a lot of it was researched online, and we got the exact location of the farm from the Maryland records. I forgot what it's called now.
I believe it's part of the Maryland Historical Society.
Yes.
Right,
So
right. Their archives.
Yeah.
And Jack, what's his last name?
Patrick.
But Jack Patrick, the husband of Helen Mays Patrick, who was a descendant, also researched some information for the historical marker that he helped develop.
Interesting. Another question. At some point, when we wrap up, you put the titles of those books on, but are there efforts to find any other Edmondson descendants? Have you?
It's interesting. The last time we presented this for the Montgomery County Historical Society, there was a descendant in the audience.
Love it.
Yeah, yep. So we just are coming across them. We came across Maria Pinkleton. I believe she gave a talk for the presentation for the Montgomery County Historical Society on Emily Edmondson was
okay.
Who she was descended from, and we found her that way. So,
and when we first in 2016, when we first organized as the Edmondson Society, before we called it the Edmondson Historical Society, we found out that there was a descendant, a great, I think maybe four greats, grandson who lived in Black Rock, Virginia. I think that's the name of this town. Mm-hmm. And we invited him to come here so we could interview him. We also interviewed people who are not relatives of the Edmondsons, but who lived in this whole Black community on Norbeck Road and who are now living in Leisure World. And were able to tell us about Leisure World was forest, it was woods, and how they walked through here on their way to school. So it was very interesting.
Well, and these descendants are learning things from you too. So it's a two-way street, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. We have a very active racial justice committee here in Kensington, and they do a lot of things in addition to hosting an annual Juneteenth. Hope you'll come to that. But part of that is we're researching on the land where Kensington sits, which was farmland, of course, history of enslavers and enslaved people. So we're digging down in our little, not quite so big as Leisure World, but trying to bring that history forward. So I was listening to you with that in mind too.
Good.
Another question, the statue in Alexandria, when was that erected?
I don't remember the year. Eric Blome from Chicago is the sculptor who made it. And the story of how it was built is interesting. A developer wanted to build a building, an office building on that site there. And the town wanted the statue of the girls because it's right by where the slave pen was. And so they made a deal with him. If you get someone to make the statue, we'll let you build the building. And so Eric Blum did it, and he used some workers, I think he said they were from Ethiopia, who were also sculptors who he worked with. If you look him up on the internet, ERIK, Eric Blum, you'll see something about him. I just don't remember the year.
I think it's fairly recently, though,
Yeah,
wasn't it? Within
it
the last,
was
I don't know, 20 years, 30
at
years.
least about 20 years at the most, if that much, maybe
Okay.
15, because we went as a group out and visited the statue.
It's kind of reminiscent of the MLK statue downtown, where you've got figures coming out of solid rock, very evocative. That
It's
really
10 feet
is.
tall. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see. I got to tell you, a lot of thank you. Great presentation. People are very enthused.
Excuse me, Kate, would it be possible for you to request that they return the slide of the books?
I will do that before we leave.
There it is.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. Any other questions, general questions for the chat box? I'm not seeing any. As usual, we thank our partners in this, particularly Montgomery Municipal Cable, who is recording, and we'll have this available on the KHS playlist on the MMC YouTube channel. We typically post it on the KHS website, so tell people who might have missed it that it's going to be available there. And our next speaker is Wednesday, March 18th. We're having a young author in who's written a book, The Hidden History of Montgomery County. And that promises to be kind of a lot of fun because it looks like his theme might be sort of fun, unknown history factoids kind of stuff. So we'll probably have that as a hybrid in person and in Zoom. So I don't know how many other ways I could say thank you for sharing. And again, I'm admiring the work that you did in running all this information down. You know, you think about that family. One thing struck me when you mentioned the girls were at college and the sister died and the other sister came home, how young they were and how much life they had lived by 18 and 20 years old.
Exactly.
Just astonishing, the experiences. I can't fathom that. So,
and if you notice, one of the slides had the family tree. I don't know if anybody noticed or paid attention to that. That was very interesting going through that history.
And where did you find most of that family tree information?
I don't know.
Was
where
one of
that
the
came
books.
from.
One of our books had it in. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Fascinating. Well, if you could do us a favor and scroll back to the slide where you had the 3 books on.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
there.
it's
up.
there.
It's up. Okay.
It should be up, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't see it, but that's
Oh.
okay too.
Okay.
There it is.
So many thank yous. Wonderful and informative. Great talk. So I think we're going to sign off now, and we're really pleased to have had you and continue on your quest for knowledge.
Thank you.
you.
It's a pleasure to have
Share
you.
it.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Love that you're sharing. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.